Serial killers are among the most frightening people imaginable, partly because of how incomprehensible their conspiracies can be. In this video, we are going to see 10 of terrifying serial killers in history. Keep watching till the end, as you never know what's coming next. Number 10. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez's deranged murder rampage is horrifying enough, but possibly even more terrifying is the truth that Lopez's current whereabouts are unspecified. You may not know how evil he is, but let me explain that to you. The local of Colombia contends to have raped and assassinated more than 300 women across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Among them, 100 were tribal women. In 1980, who is commonly known as the Monster of the Andes, was imprisoned and oversaw police to the tombs of 53 victims between the ages of 9 and 12. Lopez was found guilty of slaughtering 110 girls in Ecuador. He admitted to an extra 240 murders in Peru and Colombia and was declared insane. Lopez was released in 1998 for good behavior, and while there are a lot of rumors, no one can ascertain precisely where he is today. Number 9. Jack the Ripper, unidentified serial killer. Jack the Ripper may be a name that everyone recognizes, but no one can be specific about his true individuality. Whoever he or she was, Jack the Ripper was deranged. In 1888, Jack the Ripper threatened the Whitechapel neighborhood of London by slicing the throats and abdomens of at least 5 prostitutes and evacuating them for dead. Occasionally, he would even eliminate the woman's uterus and take it as a sort of award. It's controversial that Jack the Ripper's true identity will never be figured out, but ripperology, and examination of the murders has necessarily motivated quite a few what-if novels and films over the years. So have you read them? Number 8. John Wayne Gacy. There's deranged, and then there's the category of deranged that characterizes the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. Well, let me tell you that he was nicknamed Killer Clown because of his employment accompanying children's birthday celebrations and generous events such as Pogo the Clown. His employment gave him susceptible access to probable victims. Gacy was sentenced to raping, torturing, and slaughtering 33 teenage boys over 6 years. He would attract them to his home, assassinate them via either strangulation or asphyxiation, then conceal them on his estate. Gacy was executed in 1994. Number 7. Albert Fish. When a serial killer is labeled the Gray Man, the Moon Maniac, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Bougie Man, it's nearly obvious he is completely deranged. Fish was attempted and found guilty of raping, killing, and cannibalizing 3 kids in the early 1900s. Still, he contended that he had massacred more than 100 children, and even bragged that he had children in every state. Particularly deranged is the fact that Fish sent a letter to the mother of one of his fatalities, 10-year-old Grace Budd. The letter documented how he had attracted the little girl, suffocated her, and then cut her into chunks to eat over 9 days. Number 6. Joachim Kroll. German serial killer Joachim Kroll slaughtered at least 14 people, including young children, between 1955 and 1976. After suffocating his victims with his bare hands, Kroll would have intercourse with their bodies, then cut them up in chunks to consume. That's awful, right? Interestingly, Kroll was eventually snatched after a neighbor complained about a jam in the plumbing. The pipes were clogged with human remains. When Kroll was imprisoned, he was in the procedure of boiling body parts taken from his most recent fatality, 4-year-old Marion. Number 5. Andrei Chikatilo. Between 1978 and 1990, the Russian serial killer Andrei Chikatilo sexually attacked, slaughtered, and injured more than 50 young women and children. Chikatilo assassinated his victims by stabbing and cutting them with a knife. One of the youngest was 9 years old. Can you believe it? He didn't even spare the kids. Chikatilo later confessed that he was just able to achieve orgasm by jabbing women, a truth that made it impossible for him to withstand his powerful desires to kill. As a result, Chikatilo was nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, the Red Ripper, and the Rostov Ripper. Though he confided to a total of 56 brutal murders, he was attempted for 53, sentenced to death, and executed by the firing team in 1994. Number 4. Jeffrey Dahmer, 1960 to 1994. Without Jeffrey Dahmer, no catalog of the most deranged serial killers would be perfect. Dahmer, recognized as the Milwaukee Cannibal, was eventually sentenced for murdering 17 young men over 14 years. He also raped, dismembered, and occasionally even consumed his victims. During his prosecution, Dahmer conceded to plugging a hole into his victims' skulls in an experiment to turn them into mindless sex slaves. Although Dahmer potentially would have been executed for his violations, he was beaten to death in jail in 1994. Number 3. Harold Shipman, 1946 to 2004. Now comes Harold Shipman. Nicknamed Dr. Death, Harold Shipman is supposed to be accountable for slaughtering 218 of his patients between 1972 and 1998. Unfortunately, the number of people he's slaughtered is much higher. As a practicing doctor, Shipman had susceptible access to potential victims, which is why he was competent to be such a creative killer without putting forward suspicion. Still, because Shipman was implicated in so many cases in which patients disappeared, people ultimately started to doubt awful play. Most of his victims were old women, whom he said had perished in their sleep. But many of these women died during the day, which hit some as odd. Also, Shipman inquired about a barely huge number of cremation receipts, which grabbed the attention of an undertaker who noted the odd situations of the cremations. Finally, Shipman was convicted in 2000, but only after a victim's daughter noted that he had attempted to write a will for the victim that would name him as the successor. And the Dr. Death succumbed to suicide in jail in 2004. Number 2. Ted Bundy. You don't have to be American or have been around in the 1970s to know the man, Ted Bundy. You must have heard of him, right? If not, don't worry because I have covered him too. Bundy is effortlessly one of the most deranged serial killers of all time. His modus operandi comprised kidnapping his female victims, raping them, and then dismembering them. So are you thinking about what prize he kept for him? Well, he frequently kept the heads of the victims as souvenirs. Before he was executed in 1989, Bundy confessed to the abduction and slaughtering of 30 women, though this number is nearly necessarily much bigger. Number 1. Joseph James D'Angelo. Though his violations happened decades ago between 1974 and 1986, Joseph James D'Angelo wasn't specified as the Golden State Killer until DNA information from one of the violations was utilized to approximate a close relative of D'Angelo's, which directed to his identification and arrest. Throughout 3 different crime rampages, D'Angelo slaughtered at least 13 people, raped more than 50, and perpetrated well over 100 burglaries. One of the justifications for why D'Angelo was competent to avoid identification and capture for so long is because he was a discontinued police officer. His exercise enabled him to scheme and execute his violations while undervaluing the physical proof he left behind. He was recognized to have phoned some of his sufferers months before he assaulted them, so he could understand their habits to more effectively plan his violations. In some examples, he even smashed into his victims' homes so he could unlock doors and windows, and even evacuate items like ropes and other ligatures he could utilize to tie up his victims upon his return. One of the most frightening aspects of D'Angelo's violations is that he frequently insulted his victims, staying for hours in their residences, ransacking them, eating their food, and endangering them by assassinating their families. In some cases, he targeted couples, with whom he would segregate. For example, he would sometimes compel the female sufferer to tie up the male sufferer. He would then place containers on the male victim's back, so he could listen to if the victim attempted to move. D'Angelo would then begin by raping the female victim in another room. D'Angelo was furthermore recognized to conceal in a home, fooling his victims into thinking that he'd vacated, only to leap out of the darkness. He would frequently take trophies of his crimes with him as trophies to recollect what he'd accomplished. You must have seen many serial killer movies. These types of acts are done, I know. You all must feel frightened at that time, right? With that being said, we have reached to the end of this video. Have you ever seen a serial killer in real life? Comment your experience. Also, share this video with your friends just to scare them. Until we meet again, take care.